Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 258th New Social Environment. I'm Cal McKeever, the curatorial assistant at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for today's tribute to Barbara Rose. We're also thrilled to have the poet Patricia Spears Jones here, who will read to close today's program. To begin, I ask you to join us in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. We recognize white settler colonialism as part of the continual legacies of white supremacy, which has many contemporary expressions. We honor the memory of those who have lost their lives and to those who are working to undo this legacy of violence and injustice, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Please check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. Before I introduce our panelists, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce the panelists. Kate Bonansinga is a curator of contemporary art, was the founding director of Stanley and Gerald Rubin Center for the Visual Art at the University of Texas, El Paso, and is the author of Curating at the Edge, Artists Respond to the US-Mexico Border. Dr. Douglas Dreishpoon, Chief Curator Emeritus at the Albright-Knox, is currently director of the Catalogue Raisonné project at the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation in New York City. Dreishpoon is a consulting editor at the Brooklyn Rail. Jack Flam is a member of the board of directors at the Daedalus Foundation since 1991 and has been president and chief executive officer since 2002. He is distinguished professor emeritus of art and art history at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Alison Greene is the curator of contemporary art and special projects at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Before coming to Texas, Ms. Greene worked in the Department of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and lectured at the Cooper Union. Gary Tinterow is the director of Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Previously, he served as the Engelhard chairman of the Department of 19th Century Modern Contemporary Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Phyllis Tuchman is a critic and art historian who teaches and writes about art, particularly sculpture. She's taught at Williams College, Hunter College, and the School of Visual Arts. She's an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. And our host, Phong H. is an artist, writer, independent curator, publisher, and artistic director of the Brooklyn Rail, the River Rail, Rail Editions, and Rail curatorial projects. Phong, take it away.
Thank you, Cal. I must say that it's an incredible privilege to be here to pay tribute to our beloved Barbara Rose. And I must want to just say right from the beginning, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Alison, Gary, Doug, definitely also Phyllis, and whoever I'm missing. Patricia is here to read at the tail end. So that's very fantastic. And just want to say a few words that I know that Sam couldn't come and join us due to the last minute. So it's the same with Michael and Rachel. Michael Stella and Rachel Stella, beloved children of Barbara, and also her beloved husband, Richard Duboff. But I'm sure we'll put it on YouTube the next day. So we can also send a link to you all so you can see it when you can. I like to begin first by sharing my own story of how I met Barbara before I get a chance to sort of go through to all of our participants here. Alison, Gary, Phyllis, Kate, and Doug, and Jack. It was one Saturday in September in 1987 in the living room of the home of Maya and Lillian Shapiro that I was being introduced over the cheapest tea you can find. It's called Red Rose, where you can buy 100 tea bag package for $2. Why do I know? Because I would often do some grocery on my way to visit Shapiro every Saturday. And I remember being with Maya and Lillian and Barbara having red rose tea and graham cracker, only one for each of us. You have to remember, I learned soon that they were the product of the Great Depression, and that's what happened. We stayed together with the Shapiro for a good hour plus, which probably the most dedicated, preserved only for good friends. Not so good friends would have less time, as many of us were aware how fiercely guarded Lillian in protecting my time. In any way, we ended up living together, and we walked for like an hour or more. And Barbara told me how great, how inspiring and how generous Myers was as a teacher. And I remember so distinctly how I was also so lucky in having read her beautiful essay on Patrick Henry Proust by chance only a week before. I remember very clearly. I was able to tell her how much I admired the essay and how I came to love how he painted with his highly personal and idiosyncratic. His own reading of Cubism was so strange and visionary. And I definitely came to appreciate the painter's place in American modernism. Barbara was thrilled that I admired her essay as much as Henry Proust painted. I remember clearly later when we kept talking about it, and she was in such a high gear, such animation. At the near end, before I got a cab for her, I told her that she has beautiful, well, I paused for 4 good seconds before I say dimples. And she was so pleased. She said to me, she really liked the way that I say the word ever so slowly. And I said to her, well, that's partly because I had made so many mistakes before pronouncing that word in mistaken for nipples. So Barbara, without missing a beat, say, well, I do too have beautiful nipples. So that's the quick, expeditiously cool and irreverent version of Barbara I knew. So let's our friend to share with us their own story. So why don't we begin maybe with you, Jack? How and when did you first meet Barbara?
To be honest, I don't remember exactly when I first met Barbara. We used to run into each other at parties. We knew a bunch of artists and writers, so we would sort of see each other. But I remember that we got to have one-on-one conversations around the time of the late Cezanne show at the Museum of Modern Art. So we've been around 1977 or so.
Yeah.
And she was, wonderfully irreverent. She was really quick-witted. She could be kind of acerbic and biting, but it was always done without any, there's no cruelty in her. She was basically a very kind person, and she was a very generous person. And just a year or so ago, within the last year and a half or less, just about last year, for example, my daughter was working on a book where she wanted to know some things about Terry Lieber, and Barbara set up an interview with her, and not only for Barbara to speak, but also for, she introduced other people from that same circle to my daughter. So we, right to the end, she was really focused and generous with her resources generally. Now, the other thing, I think that for those of you who don't know, about a year ago, Barbara directed me toward an article that she had published in The Cut. And it's called, I Was Married 4 Times, Once to a Famous Artist. And it is the most hilarious recounting of married lives that I've ever read. And as some of you know, Barbara was married 4 times to 3 different people. There was also a repeat in there. But the other thing, it was very Barbara that I didn't realize until after I'd read the article and looked at the date. The date of publication of the article was April 1st, 2019, even though everything in the article is true. So anyway, but to give some sense, general, Barbara. She was very special.
Yeah. What about you, Doug?
Everything that Jack said, I would totally agree with. The sense of humor, and like a lot of people, I encountered Barbara through her writings, and this is true. I think, as you waltz through life, if you're lucky, you get to meet and get to know some of the people who you read initially and elevate as a student. And so I was one of those folks who read American art since 1900, who had multiple books, the Ad Reinhardt documents, the catalog from the Gray Art, the painting 80s catalog. So I knew the writings, but the first time we met was at the Albright-Knox, and we had invited her to come. It was 2015 to celebrate Tony DeLapp, who was a West Coast, painter and sculptor, really interesting guy. And she arrived, and I had a conversation with she and Tony that evening, and I had the Klaus Oldenburg catalog, the MoMA catalog from 1970, and I thought, I'll bring this catalog with me, and I'll ask her to inscribe it, So I did. I brought the catalog, and this is just an aside. She looked at the catalog, and it had been withdrawn from the Albright-Knox library because we probably had multiple copies, but they had stamped withdrawn in the top of the catalog. And she opens it up to sign it, and she sees this withdrawn, and she's like, "What's with the withdrawn?" She's like, "Klaus is still great." and so that's how she inscribed it. The Klaus is still great. The conversation with Tony was amazing. And I mentioned the Klaus Oldenburg situation because her humor was multidimensional, and any of us, and those of us who knew her, and I agree with Jack, I mean, she was Menschlichkeit in the sense that she was incredibly humane, and the humor was there to elevate people and to disarm people, but the humor was also there when necessary to take down power. And I think her rapport with power and hubris was one of, she called this out, and in her way, in her candid way, made no qualms about calling it out when she saw it. And I always found that incredibly refreshing. The Tony DeLapp situation is interesting because, lest we forget, she was one of the first critics, East Coast, to tackle artists and their art of the West Coast. And she went out to Irvine in '66. She was called out there by John Copeland's, who had set up the department at UC Irvine. And Irvine ended up being like Black Mountain, ended up being like Buffalo in the '70s. It was this incredibly radical art center that Copeland's headed and called in all the right people to teach. So Bob Irwin, Ed Moses, Craig Kaufman, they were all there. And Frank Stella came out with Barbara. Barbara not only made the transition west, but befriended many of those artists and carried back that knowledge to New York City, where she wrote, extensively for Art Forum and became part of the stable there, as well as many other magazines. Artists were her lifeblood, and she was artist-centric in the best, and people will, I'm sure, in our session elaborate on that. But I think it's really, really important to note that she was an old-time art historian in the sense that she felt very at home in the studio. Yeah. It was her mana, it was her her sustenance, and she brought that to everything she did, be it her monographs, her criticism, her film scripts. It was all informed by the artist. which is probably why she included artists' words in the ABC art article. They were always part of her thinking. I would kind of leave with one other, we had great conversations when we got together, and from 2015 on until her passing, we would get together whenever we could. And I went up to Rhinebeck at one point and had a great session with her, which I listened to this morning because I usually record these things. And I went up to talk about Ad Reinhardt and Barnett Newman because, and some of you may or may not know, Charles Duncan certainly knows. There was this weird court lawsuit. Barnett Newman sued Ad Reinhardt for defamation of character, 1954. It's one of the strangest, anomalous art world stories. And I was riveted, fascinated, and unsettled by it. And so I went up there to talk with her about it, and she was incredibly candid. And as Jack said, she was just generous with information. So we talked about that. We talked about creativity and aging, because that's what I was thinking about too at the time.
Lost it again.
Still are. We hear you, Phyllis. And we ended with her memoir, which she was then, writing and thinking about. And I think it's interesting that the memoir is titled, and will be titled when it's published, The Girl Who Loved Art.
It's amazing. Thank you, Doug. I have a slight idea where that came from, the love and admiration for the artist, but I will say that a bit later. I just want to make sure that to share with our audience here is that Jerry Lieber was a very famous lyricist, together with his partner, a man named Mike Stoller, who wrote all the famous songs that make Elvis Presley famous. So just in case you guys keep that in mind. I love to hear a little bit with Alison, if you don't mind, Alison, because I think you knew Barbara when you were very young. Am I right?
Yes. So unlike many of you, I came to Barbara's writings after some 15 years of knowing Barbara as an extended member of my family. My father, the painter Stephen Greene, had been an early mentor of Frank. And when Barbara became part of Frank's world, she also very much became a part of my family world. And so I was about 4 or 5 when she cannoned into our lives shortly after 1960. And, she was the personification of glamour to me. And she's probably one of the chief reasons, along with the example set by Karen Welkin and Dory Ashen, of why I became interested in studying art history and found great encouragement from her. And I don't want to go into childhood anecdotes unduly, but I have one to share with you. When Barbara lived on 73rd Street, I was still quite small, and there was an Ad Reinhardt painting, all velvety black, hanging on the wall. And I was completely drawn to it. And several grown-ups in the room, sort of jumped and said, "Don't touch." And I was like, "Oh, no, I've been raised not to touch paintings." But then Barbara took me aside and for an 8-year-old gave me a talk about why Reinhardt was an interesting painter and that it wasn't just a blackboard. And that willingness to, pay attention to someone who was curious about art. I don't think she would have ever wanted to take me to a playground, but she was already a fierce advocate early on of why anyone and everyone at any age should look at painting. We were living in Rome when she came for a visit when I was about 16. And she started telling me about what universities I might want to study after I said I wanted to be a curator. And ultimately, in 1984, she gave me a call one day from Texas saying, "I think you might like to work at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. We are interviewing to fill the position." And no New Yorker grew up thinking that they just had to move to Texas, at least not in those years. And she and Peter Marzio brought me down for an interview and very quickly convinced me that it would be an exciting place to work. And as I continue to work here over many more decades than I ever expected to, I'm constantly reminded of Barbara's legacy in the paintings that she helped usher into the collection, some of which Kate will be talking about later that were part of her 80s show, but also works by Patrick Henry Bruce and so many others that she felt were overlooked modernists. She and Bill Agee, then director, worked very closely together to expand the American canon and to really establish it firmly in Houston. And as we opened our new building in the last few months here, it is so exciting to have this legacy on our walls in our new gallery.
Oh, thank you, Alison. I mean, I'm dying to share with you some images of Barbara being so glamorous, but we have to hold there for a minute because I wanted to hear also Phyllis with us. If she's here, Carl. If not,
I'm here.
Here you are.
There we go.
Phyllis, so I know your perspective on Barbara or your relationship with Barbara has some similar overlapping with Alison.
Well, I think the three of us, you, me, Alison, we knew Barbara for most of our lives. And that's pretty much what I've written something out because it makes me more confident. Barbara Rose touched many lives, her family, her longtime friends, recent acquaintances, readers of general interest magazines, as well as esoteric art journals, museum goers, and countless artists, both famous and not so well known. Since we shared many friends in common, I know she is already missed dearly. I knew Barbara Rose for most of my life. We met a few weeks after I started graduate school. I introduced myself to her at an opening at the Modern. Soon afterwards, she invited me to the Richard Meyer designed loft in Greenwich Village that she shared with her husband, Frank Stella. As the years passed, I visited her place on the Upper West Side, the house in Connecticut near Yale, the loft in Soho, the swanky East Side apartment at the Galleria, the cottage near Bard, where she lived with her first, and as she always put it, her last husband, Richard Duboff. Obviously, she knew a thing or two about real estate, and I didn't even mention 5 of the places. Barbara was loyal, confident, determined, a linguist, an accomplished storyteller, a bit of a fashionista, a world-class traveler, someone with a great sense of humor, and she certainly had a way with words. Above all, she enjoyed her status as a bona fide muse. In looking for adjectives and nouns to describe her, I came up with a number of words that begin with IN: indomitable, intrepid, incomparable. Barbara wrote with alacrity about ABC art, that i.e. what became known as minimalism early on. And it should not be overlooked that throughout her career, versed in the fundamentals of the ABCs of language, she engaged us with a style that was easy to read, even when discussing profound subjects. Not that long ago, when I gave her a stack of clips from Vogue and New York magazine that I found in a closet, even she was awed by what she had done week in and week out. Remarkably, it always seemed as if she had written all those books, curated all those shows, visited all those artist studios effortlessly.
That's beautiful, Phyllis. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you, Phong.
Can we publish that?
Yes,
Excellent. So yeah, you just mentioned Barbara, of course, ABC Art, her landmark essay, which we will talk about that quickly. But you also mentioned Barbara as world-class traveler, which I can't help but to think of you, Gary, because you got to know Barbara differently than the rest of us. You spend time traveling with Barbara. You share the home upstate near each other where you spend time in the swimming pool, having dinner together. So can you share with us a little bit of that experience?
Yes, of course, with pleasure, and so heartwarming and excuse me, and nostalgic to hear everyone's encounter. Really, my relationship to Barbara was similar to almost everyone else's. In my case, I read her writings first as an undergraduate. I was a student of Carl Beltz at Brandeis University. He's the director of the Rose Art Museum and a friend of Barbara's, and we used her book, her History of American Art, as a textbook. I then was an intern with William Agee, director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, where I came from, in the mid-70s, and was able to see in practice the realization of the history that she had written, with a special emphasis on people like Stanton MacDonald Wright and Patrick Henry Bruce, and the works of art that she was not yet a curator at the museum when I was an intern, but she came almost immediately thereafter. When I got about 10 years after that, when I was waiting with friends in a car on Central Park West for her to descend from one of her many real estate outposts for a country weekend, and needless to say, we were waiting for quite some time in the traffic for the glamorous Barbara to descend. It was a nonstop conversation in the car, just breathless, touching on every possible subject, from politics to the art world to museology to food, what we were going to eat, what we were definitely not going to eat. And that was my introduction to Barbara, the person. And I would say there were dozens and dozens and dozens of wonderful encounters like that. Another sort of typical anecdote of Barbara is that we were both guests of the same person on the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean. And we were to be in subsequent alternating weeks. She was going to occupy a bedroom for the first week. She was between husbands. And I and my partner were going to occupy the same room on the second week. But when we arrived, Barbara was still asleep in the room. And 2.5 days later, she emerged and looking very glamorous, almost mermaid-like, in a diaphanous sarong, and sort of twisting the sleep out of her eyes. She said, I've been asleep for 3 days, and I think I'm going back in there. And disappeared. So we had less conversation that time, and we were able to find a different bedroom. But that self-confidence, that understanding of the sort of the physiology of being a human being, and her comfort with the people around her were so typically Barbara. When I think of Barbara, it's not so much IN words, but words like, intelligent, that's an IN word, but fierce intelligence, and this passionate view of the world, the artist whom she championed. And like Jack Flam said, even when she didn't champion an artist and even could be critical of an artist, it wasn't unkind, it was never cruel. She was tremendously clever, and she could make a quip that took advantage perhaps of someone. But we all understood that Barbara was just deeply generous and warm. And when I think of her generosity, I also think of what others have communicated, is her generosity, even when it wasn't expected, and sometimes when it wasn't even welcome. And her advice, for example, Alison, I think you should move to Houston. Well, just about 8 or 9 years ago, I was having dinner with Barbara Rose, and she said, I think, Gary, it's time for you to leave the Met and go to Houston. They needed a director. And so she was sending people, she was making order in the universe in her very particular way. And I know here in Houston, from her friends like Alison and myself, and from her many friends that she made in her brief stint as a curator here at the Houston Museum in the late 70s and early 80s, she had an extraordinary impact on the people around her. It's almost impossible to quantify. And what more can one ask for a career? Just an extraordinary human being.
Thank you, Gary. That reminds me so much of how I remember thinking one day, telling this to Barbara in Tody, in not far from Beverly Pepper's home. She had a home there too. That I will maybe entertaining one day that would make a publication free. And I have no clue how to do it. And you know, she said, you can't go wrong by having mine, Lillian Shapiro, as your adopted Jewish grandparents. You know, so she's so quick in having said anything like that. But someone like Kate who's here with us will show, beautiful show, the landmark show of the 80s at the Gray Art Gallery, who didn't get to know Barbara personally like the rest of us here. But how do you come about in knowing Barbara, Kate?
Hi everybody. I first read her textbook, American Art Since 1900, when I was a graduate student in 1989. So I know her only through her writings, and then became reacquainted with her when I was invited to guest curate the exhibition that she initially curated in 1979. And it's currently on view in Cincinnati, which is where I reside.
Great. And you will share with that some images.
Shall I do that now, Phong?
No, I think we can wait till later.
We
So
shared
what
the images of that exhibition
Yeah.
point during our conversation today. But just hearing what everyone has to say, I wish I had known her. I mean, and I know that she's a remarkable person because of the way she writes and the ideas that she captures in her very, very elegant prose. But hearing these anecdotes of her presence, her physical presence, and her remarkable charm and intelligence makes me regret not having known her as a person.
Well, we can certainly now, maybe perhaps, Kyle, can we share some images of Barbara looking extremely glamorous before I go to the next few questions for everybody? So that is 1981, famous photo. Can't wait to buy one day. From Timothy Winfield Sanders. And the next one's here, Barbara, Stella, Larry Poon in the order here, Lucinda Child in the very tail end, Wider Green in the middle, Warren Newman, and Bill Rubin on the far right in his looking very beautiful apartment. And I don't know, is that in the middle there is a Herbert Ferber sculpture, I think, Jack? And what is on the middle? I can't fathom.
Rothko.
The sculpture on the table there. Doug, what do you think?
David Smith, it's the cock.
Oh yeah,
Right.
amazing.
Well done.
So you see how they often have the salon there at Bill Rubin, because he was, believe it or not, having taught at Sarah Lawrence, decided to go back and do his dissertation with Shapiro. So he happened to be a bit older, but not much, maybe 5 years older. And he won the same seminar in class with Barbara. So they became friends that way. Can we see the next one? Here's a good instant. Being with François Demenil, the Souvreau, Barbara in the middle there, and Philip Glass. This is during the film that she made of the Souvreau.
North Star.
That's right. It's a wonderful film. I think she wrote the script for it, Phyllis.
Yep.
Yep. And then let's see the next one, Kyle. So this is the landmark show. I think she became friend with Lee Krasner, who I had the privilege to meet also once when she brought Lee Krasner to come and pay a visit to mine, Lillian Shapiro. And that was just right after her groundbreaking show of Lee Krasner, the first retrospective ever. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Next, Kyle. Here is very casual. A little bit later, this is 2003 with Robert Morris there standing with Rosemary Castro, who once was married to Carl Andre in the beginning in, I believe, maybe late 60. And Barbara in the middle, and Don Kynes, someone who became very close with Barbara, and they co-taught at the American University. I think Don is in the audience, so maybe we can invite Don to say a few words later. Next, Carl. Yep, this is the painting that really, this is a photo, and it's very glamorous. Of course, this is 1984. That's the painting by Paul Mannis, one of the artists that Barbara championed. Or the least like, you know, pose right there, right in front. So beautiful. I think we have the last one to share, which is Barbara upstate sharing with a lot of young artists. On the left behind her is Heather Hutchinson and just friend upstate. This is maybe Heather's family. Very beautiful. So yes, so here's another two. That's right, Barbara teaching the Chautauqua not long ago in the summer residency school program, and in front of Martin Klein, another artist I met through Barbara at that same time. Is that all we have, Carl? Thank you so much. So I was thinking, you know, about her beginning to write. It's with Michael Free encouragement around 62, the year when Cold War got worsened because Russian placed ballistic missile in Cuba. I know that, of course, JFK set a goal of landing a man in the moon before the decade and became more involved in South Vietnamese politics. Folk music became big with Dylan, with all the rise of pop music. At the same time, Warhol had his first show of the Campus Superferris Gallery. I want to mention that Sidney Janet's show, International Exhibition of New Realists, I think it's a survey of American pop art, that essentially calls Robert Motherwell. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, but Motherwell, Rothko, Guston, and Gottlieb, they essentially left the gallery, you know, because in protest of the show. So we should be mindful between then and leading to endless reviews, productive essay, critical essay, in everywhere, like Dirk mentioned, Art in America, Art Forum, New York Magazine, Partisan Review, Art Magazine, and so on. Is there one or two or even three in particular that you all have read that left a long-lasting impression in your thinking? Maybe this is the time that we can talk about ABC art. So why don't we begin?
I'd like to pick up on that because of the connection with the artists who left Sidney Janus's gallery. I remember reading ABC art at the time that it was published. And one of the things that's really interesting about that essay is that Barbara starts off telling your reader how much she loves painting. And you think that anyone who loves painting that much could not possibly like or be interested in minimal, what became to be called minimal art or pop art.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that article, I had a similar attitude. I was not particularly interested in either pop or minimalism because I thought they were too impersonal. I thought pop was kind of tawdry, an outgrowth of tawdry American commercialism. It was like, you know, capitalism patting itself on the back and saying that it is sublime or can be sublime. And so when I started reading Barbara's essay, she sort of draws you in. Mm-hmm. And then she starts to talk about the underlying zeitgeist, so to speak, of what she called the new reserved impersonality
Mhm.
and the self-effacing anonymity of the new art. And she framed it in what to me back in 1965 was such an interesting way as a reaction against self-indulgence and unbridled subjectivity. Now, at that time, it was hard for me to imagine that there was possibility of having art that would be valuable art, moving art, that would not come from a certain amount of self-indulgent, romantic, unbridled subjectivity. That wasn't that I thought at the time what artists aspired to.
Yeah.
And so Barbara then, and then Barbara also frames the new art as a kind of reaction against the excesses of painterliness.
Mhm.
And the thing that I was so impressed by in that article is that she basically turned my thinking around. Or she's saying, basically, she was saying, this is before I knew her, and she was saying, yeah, I love painting. Painting, there's almost nothing in the world that I love more than painting. And she might have also said artists generally, and the articularities, and the eccentricity and the subjectivity of artists. But at the same time, it doesn't always have to have a certain kind of expected subjective romantic effect.
Right.
And it helped open my eyes to a lot of what was happening around me. It also made me realize something else, that in rereading it recently, that I wasn't quite aware of at the time, but I very much appreciate now from the perspective of 2021, is that Barbara understood before anyone, I think, that pop art and minimalism had an enormous amount in common with each other, even though they were seen, framed at that time as polar opposites.
Mhm.
And I think looking back now from our perspective, we realize more and more how much in common they had in terms of studied impersonality, lack, sort of hesitancy or removal from idiosyncratic touch, achieving objectivity, which at first looks cold, but in fact can be sublime,
Mhm.
simply because it is so detached from the subjectivity of an individual.
Mhm.
The other thing about that essay was, at the time that I read it, even I thought, wow, this woman really can write. And looking back at it now, and over the years, I appreciated how much she could write, what a fantastic writer she was. But a sentence that really jumped to my eyes when I reread it a week or so ago, and I copied out, she writes, it was almost as if toward the Götterdämmerung of the late 50s, the trumpets blared with such an apocalyptic and Wagnerian intensity that each moment was a crisis and each act a climax. Obviously, such a crisis climate could hardly be sustained. Just to be able to hear at all again, the volume had to be turned down and the pitch, if not the instrument, changed.
Wow. How
And
beautiful.
yes, wow. I mean, that is an astonishing, not only for the rhetoric behind it, the rhythm of the sentence, the imagery, but also what I think it was Gary said earlier, the way in which, and Phyllis also, the way in which she could make something absolutely crystal clear, very complex
Mhm.
thoughts, even conflicting thoughts, and sustain it and not make it obscure or phony rhetorical. And when you read a sentence like that, it also comes from an enormous passion, a real passion for the subject. And that's one thing about Barbara that I loved, and I think everybody who knew her loved, is that she was the real McCoy. There was nothing phony about her, there was nothing fake about her. And for all of her physical beauty and her kind of elegance, there was nothing pretentious or inauthentic about any aspect of her.
Wow.
As she would let you know if you got into a difference of opinion with her.
Oh, yeah.
The other essay that at the time made a great impression on me, and I just read through very quickly, and I just want to mention, is her 1979 essay, The Myth of Pollock and the Failure of Criticism.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking of that essay when I saw the Pollock exhibition at the Museum of Modern Arts, you know, what is it now, 10 years ago, the one that Kirk Varnado and Pepe Carmel did. Because her essay came to my mind, partly because, you know, they had a little room with the Namith film of Pollock painting. And as it turned out, a friend of mine had played the cello for part of that film. So I mean, I was very touched by it, but I remembered Barbara's essay. And I remember at the time going back and rereading it, as I did a week or so ago. And in brief, as those of you who remember it, is she talks about how the myth of Pollock painting, captured in Namith's photographs and film, was so strong that people didn't know what to say about Pollock's paintings. So that the paintings got lost. And there are obvious examples, Harold Rosenberg's action painting, which Barbara says somewhere in the essay, something like, well, you know, he's not talking about paintings, he's talking about photographs when he talks about action painting. And then she talks about even people who were very eloquent writers, people that she clearly thinks very highly of, including herself. She says it's really hard to write about Pollock's paintings without the Namith photographs getting in the way. And for me, that was really an important thing. At that time, I was working on my Matisse, the Man and His Art book. And one of the things that I realized is that one of the things that I had to do in that book was make sure that Matisse and the Good Armchair could be laid to rest for good, right from the opening words of the book. Because otherwise, you're writing not about the artist, but about a myth about the artist. And that's a lesson that I learned from Barbara's essay on Jackson Pollock.
Wow, I think we should end our tribute there, Jack.
I'm
You covered so much ground already. Yikes. Very, very good. No, your turn, please. Similar what we
I would just add a few things to the ABC article, in that what really struck me was her willingness to open the lens and to look at the spectrum of possibilities that were playing out at that time. And so the zeitgeist wasn't confined to either painting or sculpture, but she was looking at Warhol's films. You know, she was looking at minimal music and listening to Lamont Young. She had her ear to the ground and her eyes in whatever dimension required the knowledge base. And she went to the place and to the places where she could see things. And so Jack, talking about seeing the paintings, not through Namith, but through the paintings themselves. She has an old connoisseurship approach, and her artist centricity is based in that empirical knowledge base. Right?
Barbara was interviewed about the article in Art in America 5 or 6 years ago, and she said that when she was asked if she had given the article its title, ABC Art, which is actually is a brilliant title. And I was a little disappointed.
The editor.
That it was actually Jean Lippman who had given the article its title. And in fact, Barbara said that she cringed when she first saw it in print. And it reminded me when I was writing for the Wall Street Journal, I did a review of a Renoir show in Boston. And I opened the paper the day that it runs, and the headline is "Worst Great Painter of the 19th Century." And I think that I'm citing that, and I was horrified when I saw that, but then I realized, yeah, that was the gist of my article. And I think the thing that's really great about the ABC Art title, it's an example of where a good editor can get at a kind of simple underlying theme in an essay that the author can't frame with that kind of naked simplicity. And so in fact, it's a very resonant title. And even though Barbara cringed at the time it was published, I think she came to really think, yes, that is a kind of definitive basic thing. And that's what the article is about, a certain basic thing.
Yeah. It's so true, Jack. Alison and Phyllis, I wanted to also mention this too, because when ABC Art was published, as Jack said, 65, and I was just reading her acknowledgement in her great auto-critique book, Essay on Art and Anti-Art, between 63 to 87. I realized when it was published, the people that she dedicated to in the book is Hollis Frampton, and the avant-garde filmmaker, unfortunately died relatively young, photographer, theoretician, and one can even say that Frampton was one of the pioneers of digital art, whom she met probably through her friend at Columbia at the time, the filmmaker Michael Chapman. Probably also through Stella and Carl Andre, because Frampton was a year before Stella, but he was already in boarding school with them in Andover. So ABC Art was written before Frampton's great film, Jack, Lemon, 69, and the other one even more famous, Goyon's Lima, remember, 1970? Both was considered the first film ever made with the language of structuralism. And that was also written before Maya Shapiro, famous essay on some problems in the semiotic of visual art, feel and vehicle in image sign. That was published in 1969. I just reread it the other night. Perhaps with maybe some amazing exception, say Yvonne Rayner's hand film, made a year later in 66. And of course, Michael Snow, Waveland, that was made in 67. So it's kind of amazing how that was written before anyone thinking about structuralist art, film, and dance, and music, and so on. So what is your impression, having reread recently, Alison?
Sorry, just unmuting here. Well, I think that you raise a good point, Phong. Film was incredibly important to Barbara, and she became a very good filmmaker in her own right. And her interviews, her focus on artists, we've already mentioned North Star, that she did with Marc de Souvreau, and Krasner's great biographical film also deserves a shout out. But interestingly, although she was close to Frampton, and I think a good reminder is that they all shared a building in Lower Manhattan on Walker Street, I believe, along with Andre and Armand actually passed through, Tingley and Saint-Phal as well, very early on in the 1960s. But filmmaking and avant-garde video did not remain a central focus of Barbara's. I think she really, she was interested and responsive across the board, but she was a paintings girl. And her own film work was in service of artists, if not in the case of de Souvreau, but typically of painters. And one thing I also wanted to mention, though, in regard to ABC Art was some years ago when I was working with James Turrell, he mentioned to me how important that article was to him because of the poetics of it. And her discussion of Malevich and Marcel Duchamp as the sort of two poles from which minimalism and pop art descended, he said was absolutely revelatory for him. And that in particular, her discussion of Malevich and the floating plane
Mhm.
and the indefinite space exactly gave him a way forward from his own experience as an aviator and as as interested in creating indefinite spaces through pure light.
Mhm.
I think the other thing that we need to remember is not only was she an advocate of artists, but truly, her writing helped clarify thinking for many artists who came after her.
So true. So, Philip, can you follow up a little bit what Alison say there? Where are you?
I have to be unmuted. Because of our time limit, and you've all been talking about ABC art, I want to bring up two other things. I was always very, very impressed with Barbara's monographs on artists. And I was very lucky that soon after I met her, I got to write the chronology and do the bibliography of the Frankenthaler Abrams book. And I just think that is one of the model monographs on an artist. And I loved Barbara writing on single artists and focusing. But I also, when we all had this little Zoom meeting the other day, I have to say that I was really in love with Barbara's Vogue articles and her Vogue column and her New York Magazine. I think Barbara was exceptional in being able to write something like ABC art and then turn around and write for the general public. I don't know, it must have been decades ago. There was a David Smith show and a symposium in San Antonio. And Barbara and I spoke on the program. And it was astonishing because when Barbara was scheduled to speak, the auditorium filled up, and it filled up with people who read her in Vogue magazine and New York magazine. She had an enormous following, not just in our little private art world.
Amazing.
One of the Vogue articles that riveted me was one dedicated to Magdalena Abramovich.
Yes.
And I don't know if any of you recall that, but the other thing that Barbara was very astute with Vogue, and I think helped by Lieberman and Leo Lerman, who are editors there then, was finding the great photograph of the artist, in a way, sort of going back against her, Pollock stance, but, through Vogue magazine in particular, she created a sort of visual archive of artists who were not being paid attention to. Magdalena Abramovich was not on people's radar. A fiber artist working in Poland, no, she helped make her work central to American audiences, and later dedicated a monograph to her.
Yes, she was shown at the time Marlborough Gallery. That's where I show her work, Alison. And the other person who also a great advocate of her work was Michael Branson. But to your point about Vogue, I thought her monograph on Alexander Lieberman was exceptional. In fact, it was Lieberman's famous 1975 Viking book that somehow landed my home in Vietnam when I was a kid, that I dreamt of one day being like him because I thought he was the coolest thing alive. He was an art director, artistic director of Vogue. He got to spend time with Picasso, Braque, and wrote this wonderful essay with incredible photograph that he took. It's called Artist in His Studio. Remember that monograph? It's funny because I turned out to be the socialist version of Condé Nast, the Brooklyn Rail. So Gary, having listened just what Phyllis, Doug, and everyone say here, Alison and Jack. You mentioned early on when you spend time with her traveling, you both often talk about Spanish art.
Yeah.
Spanish painting in particular. Can you share with us some of that?
Yes, of course. I think, Barbara's fame certainly comes through her scholarship on historical modern art, historical American art, contemporary artists, all these aspects to her personality. But she, especially with me, I guess, because for much of our relationship, I was a curator of European art at the Metropolitan. She insisted on her bona fides as a scholar of European art, historical art, and especially of Spanish art. And I can tell you, as someone who'd worked in that field, she knew what she was talking about, and she had highly sophisticated understanding. She spoke Spanish very well, as we know that she had an apartment in Madrid, and she had a really fascinating take that was not the traditional take. And it's also important to understand that as she was developing an understanding of Spanish art, it came at a time when Spain, so we're talking about 60s and early 70s, when Spain was not really open to the rest of Europe or to the world at large. Mm-hmm. And visits to Spain were not as frequent and as typical as they are today. And so it was it was a special interest of hers, and she developed a great and strong expertise. So that, I think, just underscores the wide range of interests that she has, her ability to frame almost any subject with critical inquiry, and then this natural mode of expression that she had to communicate to others. I just wanted to point out also, and Richard, her husband, will smile at this, perhaps one of her unfinished projects, although who knows, maybe it's there on her computer and we'll see it one day, which was going to be a dictionary of American Yiddishisms. And often at dinner, we would write entries for this dictionary, and we would just double over in laughter because she would create sort of Lewis Carroll nonsensical explanations for expressions that she heard one of her grandmothers exclaim. And that's yet another aspect of Barbara's personality and wide range of interests.
What does she think of your famous show, The Mad, Gary? Manet, Goya and Manet. Did you?
Oh yeah, no, we spoke about it a great deal, and she had, of course, brilliant and pertinent observations about it. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's just terrific. All right, so let's see whether we can move a little bit here. My feeling of where she is in the middle of all of her incredible multitasking activities, from being a curator, very productive. I mean, she curates so many shows, as you know. You can confirm if you can tell me that too, Alison. But she was a filmmaker. She made a film on, also beside Moctezuma, she made a film on Lee Krasner. Wonderful film on Lee Krasner, and also Tanya Grossman. I love that film. And the other film I also love that I seen in the 80s was one is called Art Work USA. You remember that, Phyllis?
No.
It's terrific film. All right, so she did films, many films, and she curated so many shows. And then she wrote prolifically. I mean, also in terms of monograph, and I can't tell you, from golden age of Dutch painting, experimenting on technology, all the way to Malevich and other artists. So my question is very simple. Very few people we know able to do well in so many multitude of undertaking. I mean, we live in a culture that really encourages us to be specialized as scholars or as historian, curator. So how would help me to understand someone like Barbara, who we all know, but I still haven't able to put my finger on how she's able to do all of those things, and she's done with equally with great ease and well. Alison, yes. What's the secret? I think you have to unmute.
I think part of it was, she had a fierce work ethic and, no writer's block. I mean, and when I was being interviewed in Houston, I can't tell you how much everyone emphasized, can you write well, because a very high standard, but she also was very good at establishing collaborations. And for example, when she did the Great Fresh Paint Show, that was revolutionary for the Houston scene, and an exhibition that was her last project here that basically set out to define a Houston school. She partnered with a local art historian and journalist, Susie Khalil, and the two of them, I think, were instrumental in reaching out to artists, making studio visits, chronicling materials. Phyllis has mentioned how she partnered with Barbara on the Frankenthaler catalog. Barbara did a lot by being fearless in working with other people. And I think that's something that is not always acknowledged. And I think that is in the, being able to cooperate.
Oh no, you just froze.
Am I still frozen?
No, you're good. Keep going. Keep going.
I think Phyllis may be frozen, but and I think that was, again, part of Barbara's talent of recognizing, good art, good resources. And, sometimes those collaborations lasted for many projects. Sometimes it was a one-off. But I think that was also, how she managed to get so much done.
Yeah. Doug, you have any similar perspective? Or
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Alison, there was one word that you used, Alison, and that was fearless. And when we met in Rhinebeck, before going there, she had sent me the first chapter to her memoir. And it was something that we talked about a little bit when I got there. And there were some things that she said that, having been raised in Washington, D.C., and having been raised by a mother who, let's just say there were big issues there and they didn't really get along. And there was always this psychodynamic was one of not feeling, good enough, or not having the support, maternal support that would have enabled her, but she acquired it on her own. And so one of the things she said to me in Rhinebeck, she said, I didn't have a choice. She said, I had to get the hell out of Washington. And I realized that in order to do what I wanted to do, I just had to do it. And she said, I had no fear. And so, Alison, to your point, I think she could tackle whatever she wanted to, one, because she was a great collaborator and generous in her willingness to do that, but also that internally and psychically she had really tough metal.
Yeah, Jack, you thank you, Doug. Jack, you taught, you wrote amazing scholarly book on Matisse and added all the anthologies and artists' writings, and you also was at the same time able to write criticism. And so I wonder whether you have some insight into how Barbara were able to do as you did at the same time.
I think part of it is passion for what you're doing. Barbara had a lot of passion, and I think fearlessness and passion are maybe two of her most distinctive traits, and they came out not only in her work, but in her conversation. When you were talking to Barbara, you were talking to a fearless, passionate person, and you knew it right through the conversation. including at times when it would kind of explode right in your face because you'd say something and she'd come back with some witty, cutting, but charming remark. And the other thing is Barbara was a very, very intelligent person. So, you know, the intelligence, the passion, and the fearlessness together, that's an amazingly heady thing. In terms of just sort of being a scholar and being a journalist, because I think that's your underlying thing, where I have some experience also. I think that what happens is scholarship is very constraining. I remember Leo Steinberg saying to me once, it's actually, he said this in print also, that when he was first at the Institute of Fine Arts, Walter Friedlander said to him, "You write too well to be a good artist." And I remember when I was a graduate student, there was this idea that art historians didn't write well. You were supposed to write in a kind of plodding, meat and potatoes, somewhat turgid way. And it's almost as if the modesty of your clothing as a writer was a sign of good faith as an art historian. And one of the things that my experience writing for the Wall Street Journal, I was their art critic for almost a decade, and for the New York Review of Books and for various magazines, is that it makes you realize that you've got to be serious about your writing all the time. And then in fact, there is an advantage to being a scholar. If you can get past the constraint of wanting to write in a turgid way that you've been trained to do as a scholar, pay attention to original sources. I remember when I first started writing for the Journal, I got my first press release. I'd never seen a press release in my life. And suddenly I realized something, that many people that I read over the years, like John Russell, who wrote for the Times, who could write on any subject, and he was so knowledgeable. And of course, it had never occurred to me, that's because everybody read the press releases. And without naming names, when I was starting to go to openings to cover things as a journalist, in talking to a lot of my colleagues, I realized that they were very dependent on the press releases. Whereas I myself wasn't. In fact, I would never read the press releases until after I wrote my article on purpose, because I didn't want to be swayed by it. And I think that's the kind of thinking, that's something that Barbara and I think had in common, is that you want to try to think for yourself. And I think that writing for a broad audience means that you have to see clearly and write clearly and precisely. And I think that's,
Yeah. Well, that's very good. Phyllis?
Well, we can't emphasize enough how much Barbara loved artists. And she loved going to studios. Sometimes I would be astonished at some of the studios she would go to. And she listened. She always listened to what anyone said. She listened to what artists said. And I think it's very exciting. I noticed that Roberto Polo is now listening to us from Spain. And the last show that Barbara got to do a number of years ago was an exhibition in Brussels that she did with Roberto.
Yes.
And she really loved to put the artists forward to let you know what they were thinking and what they were doing. And that can't be emphasized enough. From ABC Art to the last book that she did, the exhibition catalog for Roberto.
Yes, and that will be in the film that Terry Demish made, which we will find the time to share with our audience. Phyllis, thanks for mentioning that. And thank you also for mentioning that Barbara loved being in the artist studio, which she and I once spent dinner at Urban Sandler. And we talk about urban concept of on-the-spot history. You learn art history by being there with the artists on the spot. And that have affected how the rail the writer derailed, the interviewer derailed, how we always find that resourceful and truthful. And our admiration to the artist is very basically rest on the same idea, same framework, Phyllis, so thanks for that. Gary, you have any last words to say about Barbara's ability to somehow go back and forth through our historical time with such great fluidity, with such ease? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, obviously, lots of practice, certainly, and this that her mind was always working. There was either she was sleeping for 3 days, or she was running at 180 miles an hour. So there's this extraordinary energy, and then a discipline to apply herself at all times. So there was just no casual conversation with Barbara. Everything had a point. Even when we're being ridiculous at dinner together, there was a point to that ridiculousness. But I actually had, and I hope you don't mind me jumping in this way, a question really for us today, because I think it might help us, and I don't know the answer to it, situate Barbara and her time. And that has to do with Barbara's relationship to feminism, because she was active at a time when feminist art history was emerging. She was the same generation of the great protagonists of feminist art history, Linda Nochlin et al. And yet her autobiography is going to be called The Girl, listen to that word, who loved artists. And obviously she's talking about male artists. So I wonder what others have to say about that, because she certainly was a woman with extraordinary agency. She worked very effectively in a man's world. She had positions of power and influence. She was tremendously successful in everything that she did. And so I wonder how others see her in relationship to feminism, just as a larger movement, and specifically to feminist art history.
What a great question, Gary. Let's start with Dr. Dreishpoon.
I defer to Phyllis and Alison.
Okay. Phyllis?
Well, I think she wrote on a lot of artists. And so a number of the artists who we were both very close with, Helen Frankenthaler, Beverly Pepper, Nancy Graves. I mean, she championed so many artists who were women that I don't know how to answer the question.
I can contribute to that. I think that she contributed to feminism and feminist art history through action rather than theory. So for example, the American Painting Show, of the 41 artists in the show, 18 of them were women. She didn't talk about that per se, but at a time when women were underrepresented in the art world, I think that is a gesture and a statement in and of itself.
That is so true. Alison?
And I think she would, concur with that. I think by labeling something feminist, she would have seen that as a restricting category rather than an open category. And so I think I never heard her be critical of Linda Nochlin or other, but I think rather than question, why are there no great women artists? She paid attention to the great women artists. The project that she never finished, and I think was very dear to her heart, was a major film dedicated to Georgia O'Keeffe, and who I think for many American scholars at least is pinpointed as, the feminist ideal in the first modern era.
And well-known
women artists, for example, in her 80s show, she included some of the more obscure artists, Emeritus Johnson, for example, who was completely unknown. And so, it was just right across the board. I think the comment that she's a feminist by acting rather than by talking about it.
Yeah, but Jack, it's so interesting about this question too that Gary raised, partly because there must have been pressure, maybe not from knowing the beginning, but maybe the tail end, knowing people like Lee Krasner, and Frankenthaler, or even John Mitchell for that matter. I mean, these are women who have to be tough to survive the New York school, smoking, drinking. And so I think whatever the mediation between knowing those people and then embracing more younger, obscure artists that you say, lesser artists or lesser known, I think Barbara might have been somewhat encouraged too for having studied with Shapiro Columbia, because Shapiro was also very supportive. A lot of his woman students who were doing dissertation with him, Barbara White, I can think of one, and few others. So he was really go out his way to ensuring they would get job in different universities, you know, Jack. So maybe have looked there the same way we think of how she come to the tail end. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, Alison. I think her lecture on the Beatus manuscript was a kind of return, almost like an homage to Maya Shapiro. By the way, she made a film on Maya, which she threatened to organize a huge fundraiser for the rail. She basically said that when I get better, I want to show this film, bring it all my influential, wealthy friends, and have a huge benefit that would go raise funds for the Brooklyn Rail to keep it free and alive and independent. I think this is a good place to start, because I love to find time to give the mic to Kate, who can give some of the thing that we just talked through. And this is a nice way to share that with our audience here. Kate, take it away, please.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Phong. I really appreciate you inviting me to be here. It's really an honor. I'm going to share my screen now, and I've got about a 15-minute presentation for you all. So I hope you can bear with me for that amount of time. And I'll share with you some images, archival images from the Gray Art Gallery exhibition in 1979, and then move along to some images from the exhibition as it's currently situated at the Cincinnati Art Museum. How's that? Can you all see? See my screen? Yes, thumbs up. Okay, great. So the exhibition, as Barbara conceived of it, was titled American Painting the 80s, A Critical Interpretation. We have called the exhibition American Paintings the 80s Revisited, because we have taken a sort of a historical approach and basically recreated the show to the best of our capability. Let's see.
I'm sorry, Kate, would you mind pressing maybe the swap displays button? We're seeing the, we're not seeing the slideshow.
Thing.
No, sorry, yeah, great.
So now it's just the screen. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm going to share about 5 images, archival images of the exhibition as it looked at the Gray, and then several more of the exhibition as it's currently situated in 2 galleries at the Cincinnati Art Museum, which is what you see here. My hope is that you will come to agree that Rose's courage in curating this exhibition may have contributed to painting holding its own as a medium of expression during a time when painting was under siege. One might speculate that Rose's determination in part helped painting to endure through to what it's become today. This is the wall that you see when you enter the exhibition in Cincinnati. You exit the elevator, and this is one of 2 galleries in which the exhibition is displayed. What you see here is an Announce by Mark Schlesinger on the right, and Windmill by Robert Moskowitz on the left. So as you all know, by the late 1970s, New York City was the center of the international art world, and works in video, photography, sculpture, performance dominated the avant-garde. With the exhibition American Painting the 80s, Rose resisted this trend and reasserted the supremacy of painting. The show consisted of 41 paintings by 41 artists. Near as I can tell, 40 of them lived in New York City at the time. They ranged in age from 27 to 52. All of them were focusing on formal concerns and the material qualities of paint. Most of them were in their 30s, and relatively unknown. 18 were women at a time when women were underrepresented in the art world. The artists included Sam Gilliam, Elizabeth Murray, Nancy Graves, Robert Moskowitz, Lois Lane, this is Lois Lane, Louisa Chase, and many others, but those are just a few examples. And here's another image of the transition space between Gallery 1 and Gallery 2 at the Cincinnati Art Museum. So though the paintings were all from the 1970s, and many of them stylistically looked back to abstraction of earlier decades, the exhibition title touted that they represented the 1980s and the future. The exhibition garnered dozens of reviews, and critics took issue with the title, premise, and organizing principles of the exhibition. In one of Rose's obituaries, she is quoted as stating that she endured more criticism than Hillary Clinton. So I wanted to offer some examples of what the critics said about this show. John Ashbery in New York Magazine said, quote, "Her emphasis on so-called traditional techniques and materials seems unduly reductive." Douglas Crimp in October, quote, "For Rose then, painting is a high art, a universal art, a liberal art, an art through which we can achieve transcendence and catharsis." All of this, of course, in direct opposition to that art of the 60s and 70s, which sought to contest the myths of high art, to declare art to be contingent upon the real historical world. End quote. Hilton Kramer in the New York Times said, "The feeling of deja vu is strong. Thick paint is back, and so in some cases are drips. It's hard to believe that it signifies anything special. There is a paucity of ideas in this exhibition." Donald Cuspid in the Arts Magazine, "Rose preempts the production of a period before the period has occurred with a kind of absolute critical arrogance. To predate art and to predetermine its meaning are to interfere violently with its possibilities and to violate its present and future audience." And the final one I'll quote is Hal Foster in Art Forum, who stated, "Much of the work is reactionary, merely contrary or sympathetic, cutting short any reflection of a dialectical nature." End quote. So Rose's response to this was, and I summarized, she had a lengthy response. There's a whole exhibition catalog, as you all know, with a very, very eloquent essay in it, but she quoted, there's a film about the exhibition in which Clement Greenberg stars, so does Rose. And she, as part of this film, she responded, and I summarize, "I feel very strong that there is an American tradition in painting, and I spent a good part of my life trying to find one. I think that the artists in my show certainly continue that tradition. And I think it begins with the early modernists of the Stieglitz school, O'Keeffe, Dove, Hartley. And we do have a native tradition in art, and we are becoming more conscious of it. Most of the best painters of our time seem to have chosen the abstract idiom." End quote. So the controversy that the exhibition generated is testament, in my opinion, to the boldness and courageousness of its proposition and its premise. Let's see, This is a view of the first wall that you see when you walk into the exhibition in Cincinnati. So the show not only garnered media attention. It says my screen is paused. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. The show not only garnered media attention, it also secured an international tour. An entity called the Foundation Fine Art of the Century organized that tour, and the exhibit traveled to Houston, Tel Aviv, and 12 other cities in Europe. The first European stop was Paris at the American Cultural Center, and the final stop was in Lisbon, Portugal, which was in June, July of 1982, at the Gulbenkian Foundation, which purchased 5 of the paintings. After the remaining 36 paintings returned to the United States, replacements for the ones that remained in Portugal were added to the collection. There was one by Dennis Ashbaugh, and this is the replacement painting from 1983.
Kate, we are, it seems we're stuck. Oh, there. All right.
Can you see Ashbaugh? And there's another by Howard Buchwald. Can you see that? For some reason, it's saying my
No,
screen is.
I'm happy to take over the screen sharing if you want to stop.
There we
Okay,
go.
whatever you think, Cal. I'm not
Yeah.
sure why.
If you press stop sharing, I can hop in right where you were. There.
There, thank you. So it's Howard Buchwald. Next one's Carol Eggleston. Meredith Johnson is next. And the final one is Catherine Warren. These are the 5 replacement paintings. So in 1984, Cincinnati-based collectors Ronnie Levinson Shore and John Shore become part of this story. The couple was married in 1961 and purchased their first work of art that same year. Their collection now numbers more than 300, from ancient bronzes to contemporary paintings, and includes work by luminaries such as Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. Over the years, they have maintained an apartment in New York City in order to facilitate their businesses in transportation and real estate, as well as their interest in art. In 1979, the Shores, at the recommendation of Cynthia Goodman, who's a family friend of theirs, also a Cincinnati native, visited the Gray to see American painting in the 80s, a critical interpretation. At the time, the Shores owned paintings by 3 artists in the exhibition, Schlesinger, Chase, and Richard Hennessy. According to Shore, John Shore, art dealer Paul Haim, presumably the founder and proprietor of the aforementioned Foundation Fine Art of the Century organization, purchased all 41 of the paintings in the exhibition directly from the artists, and he was also financially responsible for the tour. In 1984, after the tour, the Shores, with the assistance of art advisor Leslie Rancow, offered to buy all of the paintings from Haim. Haim had been storing them for 2 years and was ready to sell. Sometime between when the work returned from Europe and the Shores purchased, I think the next one is a Rothenberg. Haim sold Susan Rothenberg's Black in Place, which was part of the tour and part of the show that Rose curated, to another collector who in turn donated it to the Museum of Modern Art from New York. And MoMA's website states that the piece was a gift from Edward Broida. So presumably Broida is the person who purchased it from Haim. Between the mid-1980s and 2010, the Shores displayed a portion of the exhibition in their office. You can go to the next slide. In Cincinnati and in their residences in Cincinnati and Florida. All 40 of those paintings are currently on view at the Cincinnati Art Museum. And also on view is Susan Rothenberg's bag. The untitled drawing that you see here from 1976, the Shores purchased to replace the Black in Place because it was no longer part of the collection. And then you see the Elizabeth Murray. So what you just saw the entire gallery 1 of the Cincinnati Art Museum, which is the Schlesinger, the Moskowitz that we saw on the first slide, and then the Murray and the Rothenberg. And then next you'll see the transition space between the 2 galleries with the Sam Gilliam. And then we enter the main gallery here with the Meredith Johnson. The next I want to show you are some of the Gray Art Gallery archival images. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is a photograph of the Gray Art Gallery in September of 1979. Sam Gilliam's Tequila is in the foreground. Susan Cryle is in the middle ground, and Edward Eucalyptus Fragrant Hill is in the background. Next view is another view of the exhibition. On the wall to the left are paintings by Dennis Ashbaugh. So you see the original piece that the Gulbenkian then purchased by Ashbaugh. Anna Bialo-Broda is next to him, Mark Lancaster next to him, Meredith Johnson in the middle ground, and then Peter Omlar is in the background. Next one. See the Graves, Nancy Graves in the foreground, Susan Cryle in the middle ground behind the pillar, and then again the Johnson. And I want to say, looking at this slide, in Cincinnati, we opted not to recreate the classical columns and the burlap covered walls of the Gray, but we did opt to hang the exhibition just as tightly and also did our best to honor the relationship between the paintings that was established at the Gray. So for example, since you could see both the Johnson and the Graves from the same, from a single vantage point, we attempted to recreate that capability in the 2021 exhibition. The available archival photographs do not give a comprehensive view of the exhibition. In fact, you've seen them all already.
Oh, shit.
And many of the paintings in the exhibition were not captured, so we used the information that we had. Next one, please, Cal. So here you see Louisa Chase in the foreground, Elizabeth Murray, and then the Schlesinger next to the Murray. And then one final one is Bialo Broda in the foreground, then the Ashbow, then Elaine Lustig Cohen to the Ashbow's left, and then the 5-panel piece by Carol Eggleston's in the background. And one more, there's actually one more of the Gray, which is Stuart Hitch, Ghost Rider, which is the next slide. Okay, next, and if you could just go through these slides, Cal, I've got about 7 or 8 of them. And what I'd like to describe is the way, the next slide, please, the way the main gallery is structured is it's a square gallery and there's a light well right in the center of it, right in the middle of the floor. So usually the light well is framed with a waist-high wall and visitors can peer over it into the galleries beneath. But for this exhibition, the museum constructed walls around that well to create adequate wall space for the exhibition. So you just saw the last slide was the first wall you'd see. And then if you turn around and face the entry vestibule, you'll see the wall from the next slide. That's what you would see if you were, your back was at the Meredith Johnson piece. And so people tend to like enter and then turn to their right. So 4 left turns later, you've basically circumambulated the well, the light well, and seen the entire exhibition. So it's really just painting after painting, each of which is a powerful expression in and of itself. But collectively, in my opinion, the exhibition creates an even more important statement about painting from a specific time and place when painting was neither championed nor encouraged. And then there's one more turn. And then one more, and we're back at the beginning. There you are. So one of the questions I have for the audience, because this is something I have not been able to uncover during the time I've spent reading and thinking about this exhibition, I'm not sure what its genesis was. I'm not sure if the Gray reached out to Barbara and asked her to curate an exhibition, or asked her to curate an exhibition specifically of painting, or if Barbara conceptualized the exhibition and then afterwards secured a venue. So if there's anyone amongst you that knows the answer to that question or anything else about the exhibition, I'd be very grateful in having that information.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's very well-rounded and spoke so well of how swiftly she could put together. Alison, you have something to add?
Yes, I really appreciate the thorough walkthrough, Kate. And one of the things that I think Cincinnati captures that was also apparent at the Gray Art Gallery is how densely hung it was. And I think, Barbara was, sort of almost pushing against the clean white cube. And the same thing happened with our fresh paint exhibition, it too, which was staged 5 years later, was practically cheek by jowl. And I think for Barbara, the way that she presented exhibitions, particularly of this nature, and I unfortunately did not get to see the last show in Belgium, the generosity was the most important thing. It wasn't about, staging a space that photographed with elegance. It goes against a lot of curator practice, actually. She was really interested in telling the complete story, or as much of the complete story as she could get into the space. And I think that's something that is a takeaway from how she presented the show, as well as the content of it.
And I think she, from what I can tell, was just interested in providing as many artists with as much opportunity as possible. So exhibiting their work and creating an audience for them was one of her goals.
Yeah, no, it's super true. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Alison. And just to the point also, before now we're about to open to the Q&A, is to follow what Jack said earlier about her love for painting, which is true. But, you know, we also had to keep in mind, she wrote beautifully on Diana Arbus and other photographer. And we should also forget that she wrote beautifully, equally so, with Mark de Soubreau, Eva Hesse, and Richard Serra, and endless other. Her old friend from Colombia, Lucas Samaras. So we have a huge tribute that will be published as a web exclusive sometime in mid-April. So I will keep you all posted. But for now, let's give the mic back to Carl to open up the Q&A. Thank you, Alison and Kate. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Phyllis.
Well, thank you, Phong. First, we have a question from Theodore Harris. I asked that if anyone else has questions or memories they want to share, please drop them in the chat or raise your hand. I can call on you. Theodore, I'm asking to unmute you to ask your question.
Hello, hi. Thanks for doing this today. I had made a work titled After Barbara Rose, in which I quote her in the work when she says that there was not one single person in the circle of Clement Greenberg who ever had an idea, unquote. What do you think she meant by this? She had made this statement during a talk of an Al Held exhibition a few years ago. Can anybody elaborate, tell me what she thought of Greenberg in this quote? Thank you.
I'll volunteer. I think that what Barbara was alluding to was the fact that in the tight circle around Clement Greenberg, you couldn't talk about certain artists positively. Frank Stella was one of them, by the way. And in fact, I remember a prominent curator who was part of the Greenberg crowd, and I shared a cab once, and we both had a fair amount to drink. And at one point, I was dropping him off. He was staying with some friends. He was from out of town. And at one point, he said to me, "Jack, you think we were wrong about Stella?" And it was almost like some sort of a cult belief that there were certain artists that were on the outs. And therefore, I think Barbara felt this discouraged a certain amount of independent thinking, which is so very important to Barbara. And in fact, she in one place, I don't remember where, refers to the Greenberg crowd as being a kind of Maoist circle. So I think that's the background to that comment.
You know, I would just add on what Jack just said, that if the Greenberg approach to thinking about art was somewhat constrained and myopic, the Rose approach was completely wide open and the lens was full. So someone like Greenberg, and Barbara said this to me once, she said, Greenberg called Ad Reinhardt a stinker. And for Greenberg to have done that on whatever level it was, whether it was personal or political or ideological, was to rankle her core. So that she would have made that statement, Theodore, is not surprising.
I see Roberto has raised his hand. I can ask to unmute you.
Yes, hello. Hello from Madrid. In any case, I conceived with Barbara the exhibition Painting After Postmodernism. And in her text for the catalog, because Barbara was a curator, she expressed very clearly her opinion and thoughts on Greenberg, which she found, and I do too, canonical and restrictive. Do you hear me there?
Mhm.
Ah, okay, very well. Unfortunately, the show didn't go to the USA. It went from Brussels to Malaga and then to the Palace of Caserta, where she added Italian artists. But Barbara's view was very open. It was not about fixing boundaries for art. Art was free expression. She did believe very strongly in painting, and like in the 80s show, she was always defending, militating for the what makes painting painting, which is surface, its tactility. And it was really our goal with that exhibition, not only through male artists from America, Belgium, and then Italy, but also to show the work of women artists like Lois Lane and Karen Gunderson, and in Italy, Rossella Vasta. So Barbara was always open. I must say, she was the most important person in my life during the last 6 years of her life. And I'm in Spain now, thanks to Barbara, with this museum in 2 cities, which bears my name and shows part of my collection. She was an extraordinary woman and very passionate about this country, where she also defended many, many artists, like Juan Bordes and Juan Garayzábal and many others. But her ideas about Greenberg were very clear in her text for painting after postmodernism. I don't know if the catalog really reached the USA. I know it was for sale on Amazon, so maybe some people were able to read it. But I wanted to make just that comment.
Well, thank you, Roberto.
No, you're welcome.
We appreciate all the comments, nice memories shared in the chat as well. So at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our lunch with a poem, and we've carried that tradition to these community events. And so today, unfortunately, our poet had to leave early, but Patricia Spears Jones, but in place of that, some of my colleagues, Malvika and Tai, will be reading some of Patricia's work for you all. So Malvika, Tai, feel free to unmute yourself. Take it away.
Hi, first I want to thank you all for this really lovely conversation. Malvika and I are going to be reading verse by verse my favorite poem by Patricia called Mythologizing Always, 7 sonnets. And I'm going to start, and then Malvika, when is you?
I'll jump in.
Lovely. 1. Here is a place where declarations are made, where the heart part takes precedence. The gleam glows bland. This is the heart part, intense improvisation on the I-thou axis. Pity the poor actors, darlings, dust in their throats, choking. Dialogue ancient, concentrated chatter dictated by clouds. Click of whispers, dammed up phrases, mythologizing always. Moans move through their limbs like wind through trees, talking mad talk across the illuminated avenues of hard cities.
2. Take the skin, take off the skin, remove the vital organs one by one, especially the heart. What is left? The skeleton. The skeleton is made of calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, etc. An amazing catalog of chemicals you are holding in your arms, an amazing catalog of chemicals. The elements clash tenderly, sparking compounds that move like eels under touch.
3. Dime falls, your voice rises, fevered. It's keen, the way the wind whips this garbage up and around, like a father swinging his baby. We are holding hands, and yes, giggling, no force can stop us now. We are singing all the James Brown songs we know, helpless, off-key, but exhilarated. Columbus Avenue breakdown, how the puddles in the sidewalks radiate splendor, glass broken against high-rise buildings. Beckon, we are hungry, the shifting children salsa, and you may be our feast. Please linger. You offer me your laughter. I take the sweat from your cheeks and hum.
4. Taste like tears, sea flaked and heated. Taste like try again and go nowhere. Maybe this is the sonnet that mimes itself. Sequences silent and perceptive. The might have saids, the stomach-eating rage, the possibility of conversation is in its possibilities of interpretation. Here's where the mime becomes important because the words sound so dumb. And here's where the anxiety dance gets choreographed. It goes like this. You turn clockwise. I turn counterclockwise. We stop, stumble, resolve our steps, begin again.
5. You slipped into something dangerous after attending to your intimate conferences. Thirsty friends forever requesting water. Or is it blood they want? Your blood. Somebody is screaming. Is it me? Here on the side street being a sideshow for passers-by. You put on your silver armor. I have only my quaint devotion. It is not enough. You say I can't eat your food, baby, but I still like your cooking. Did I trip? Did you? That Mingus record is still revolving. You smile serenely. I can barely breathe.
6. If I could waste myself, I'd do it right here in public. Curse your name till my tongue bled, the same tongue that searched out the darkest spot on your back and licked it like chocolate. Curse your name like you were some broken god in need of further profaning. But I am no good at playing victim. Sadness is so private. These tears on the Uptown Express. Take that tired song off the constant stereo. It keeps reminding me that what brought me to you was music. You said you never lied to me. Fucker. You take the exit sign home with you, but I won't become invisible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ty and Malvika. We really appreciate you closing out this beautiful tribute today to Barbara's life and to Barbara's work. And thank you, Kate. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Phong. And thank you all for tuning in today. We really appreciate it, and for the questions as well. So we are celebrating the Rail's 20th anniversary this year, and the Rail is a nonprofit organization. So if you enjoyed our event, please consider making a donation to keep the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent. And join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for Queer Communion, Ron Athey in conversation with Amelia Jones. You should now be able to turn your microphones off and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Roberto.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks,
Thank you,
Alison. Thank you,
Alison.
Gary.
Everyone.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Phyllis.
Thank you, Cal.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate.
you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
all.
Gary.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Malvika.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
We send our love to Barbara.
you.